Hi, students. Welcome back. I have Stacey Linch from Phoenix, the city of Phoenix, back with us to talk about IT governance and controls in this module. We've already covered I would say, general governance. So kind of corporate governance earlier on in the semester. Remember, it was things like the boards and the charters for the boards and policies and standards and maybe your diversity, equity, inclusion processes and performance management programs, even internal audit or ERM. All of that is considered, a part of your governance within an organization. I want Stacey to talk to you about what does IT governance look like? So it's kind of this little arm to overall governance. And I want her IT expertise to kind of explain that a little bit more to you.
Yeah, I think like we were talking about previously is there is a lot of parallelism with the enterprise governance and IT governance. There's that organizational structure, which can be very critical when it comes to IT, because you are going to have multiple different departments or divisions of your agency. So you may have your fiscal division in HR, or, at the city of Phoenix, we have the police department and the fire department. And if they're all doing their own thing when it comes to technology, you're just going to have a hodgepodge of systems you have to monitor. So having that organizational governance in IT is very important for that consistency, or if anything, just the knowledge of what technology do you have in your environment. It also helps with, the approvals. If you have somebody that just goes and buys a new system or application and puts it on your network, how do we know that, vendor they bought it from is a secure company? So the organizational governance is going to help with that. From an organizational governance, when it's IT, what we want to see is that risk assessment, which you probably already talked about, ERM, but that risk assessment is going to go through and identify, here's all the systems we have, here's all the applications, how old are those systems? Is somebody running on a Windows 97 application? Because you need to include that in your strategy, because then each year or 5-year cycle, what assets do we need to replace? Where do we need to spend our budget? And if you didn't do a risk assessment to know what systems you already have out there, you're going to have some challenges, which could lead to catastrophic database failures, cybersecurity attacks. So risk assessment planning in IT is very important. And the other aspect I think I would throw under governance for IT is service level management, which I don't know if you have talked about vendor management, but that really is what it is. Vendors, it's so much cheaper now for organizations to outsource IT, but the governance side, then you can't just outsource it, pay the bill, and assume everything's working. You have to monitor what your vendors are doing. Is the system running like it's supposed to? Is the data kept secure? Because if it's not going to be, XYZ system failed. It's going to be the city of Phoenix system failed. So service level management, vendor management is very key in IT governance.
Yeah, I think you hit it, a great topic there, just talking about the different SOC reports. So SOC, so SOC 1s and SOC 2s, we'll get into a little bit of that, not too much detail in this class, but that really is managing the vendors. And are they paying attention to the IT controls and governance within, their organizations?
Yeah.
I
Are
know.
they getting audited?
So their management, our management can't be like out of sight, out of mind, right? And like just think they're taking care of it. We have to monitor that. So that's such a great point there to include that in a level of IT governance as well. So things like, I look at it as a decentralized IT function is kind of a bad thing, right? Especially in today's world, because like you said, we want to make sure we have that governance over what everybody's doing. So typically you'll see a chief information officer, a chief information security officer, a CISO is really kind of a critical role right now. Cybersecurity kind of divisions, even, or teams. I know I have a friend that does compliance, security compliance, and she works directly for the CISO and does a lot of the governance activities, but even physical security, badging in and badging out of buildings and those kind of things. Yes, those are going to be controls at that control level, but if you think of them as big picture, they're kind of governing the way we access our buildings as well. So there's a little bit, I feel like, overlap there. And I do know one thing I wanted to mention is just how many probably IT policies are out there, whether what vendor you use, or can outsource to, like you said, what are the requirements if we use a vendor and our information's on the cloud? I mean, we need to check where, who can access that, right? And those kind of policies, whether it's cyber or anything else, I think those would be an example of governance as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Because if everybody is doing their own thing, then you're going to have, the chaos, but the governance, let's know this is the policy of how you handle things. And so there's that consistency, which is really what you need in technology.
Yes, absolutely. So when we go down a level from governance, obviously in the general organization, we talked about governance, then we talked about risk. So you kind of already talked about that. We're going to do specific risk assessments for IT. And then the third level or layer that I think of is control. So now we need to make sure we have what we call ITGCs, and then there's going to be some other type of IT controls we'll talk about, but ITGCs are IT general controls. Can you help give some examples, kind of real world examples of what that would look like or what it looks like at the city?
Yeah, absolutely. At the city, we kind of categorize them into two different buckets. One, information security, and then the other one's computer management. Information security is going to go down to the level access management. Who has access to the system, to the information? We want to have the segregation of duties, and nobody should have access to certain information if it's not in their roles and responsibilities. So it goes down at that level. But it's also password management. We all know how important it is to change our passwords or implement multi-factor authentication. So looking at how people are accessing our system and who is accessing the system. But then the other thing that we'll look at is how the system is configured. If you hear about any data breaches or things happen in the news, it's going to be probably related to somebody configured something wrong in the system. They forgot to uncheck a box, or they had it configured to route the information this way and it should have gone the other way. So that's really critical. And that can be fairly complex. I mean, think about there's Windows and Mac, and I can tell you, I probably know Windows inside and out. I couldn't configure a computer, but then when you come to Mac, I'm like, I'm not as strong there. So that can be an area that takes a lot of knowledge. Network security is another one. And that's basically, as simple as, do you have antivirus or anti-malware software running on your computer? If you have the tools in place, are you monitoring what happens on your network? Is there failed logins that are happening? And then also with that is then tracking trends in that information and giving that monitoring information to the individuals that need it. The other section I talked about was computer operations. And I say computer, but think computer in from your laptop to maybe a desktop computer to a server in a data storage area. But the first thing, Keith, identify your assets. If you don't know what you have, you don't know what's plugging into your network. So really looking at having a complete inventory. And then patching. We all get those updates on our computer that says we have a new update for you. Making sure that those are current. The vendor of that application has determined something needs to change, and it's not always going to be, here's the new latest and greatest. It's going to be, they found a vulnerability when they were doing their vulnerability management that they needed to fix because it wasn't configured correctly. And then we would look at backup and recovery. If your computer fails, you have it backed up to the cloud, or is it all stored on the computer? I don't know how. I mean, when I was going through my master's and I lost one of my papers, I didn't have it saved somewhere correctly and it was gone. And panic, rewriting a paper at the last minute. Very scary. And I think the other thing that we would look at is what we refer to as service desk management. But that's your help desk. And that's making sure that, as simple as our calls being answered and are they being resolved, but then looking at the trends of the information that's coming in. Is everybody calling in saying they're having an issue with this software? Well, that may mean something's going on in your network. But those, I'd say, information security and computer operations are two of the key areas for IT general controls.
Okay, so that's awesome. And you mentioned the word software, which got me thinking of the other type of IT controls that are out there, which I know are typically called application controls or application level controls. And maybe you know of different types, or maybe you guys categorize them differently, but can you talk specifically to what maybe one of those would look like?
Yeah, application controls typically are for us a completely separate audit. And that's where you're looking at one individual application. And you could be looking at how the passwords were configured in that application, because we all know we have 20 different passwords. But then also within that application, there's what they call input controls. What controls in the design of the application make sure the data is input correctly? You know, you've been filling out a form for maybe applying for a loan, and it says, nope, you know, your salary, that's a required field. That's an input control. Or making sure that it's formatted correctly. If it's a date field, I shouldn't be able to type in just letters. You know, I need to put in numbers as well too. So this application should be checking that on the input controls. And then there's also processing controls. So if when I hit submit on an action, the application should know it now needs to auto trigger an email to Joe so that she knows a new loan was submitted. That would be a processing control. And then there's output controls. So data coming out of the system needs to be accurate. So if you had 50 new people apply for loans today, you should be able to run a report and it's going to list these are the 50 people that applied for a loan. And if it doesn't reconcile, then you know something's gotten lost in the application, or even that the fields are outputting correctly from the system. So that's another type of IT controls that are specific to a certain area.
I don't even think I'm going to need to do a lecture video on these, because Stacey just basically told you the three types of IT controls. The one thing I would love for you to mention is automated versus manual. Could you kind of explain in your terms those two? Because that's really the only other thing regarding IT controls that we're missing in this one.
Yeah, I mean, automated is going to be that, you know, the system is doing it for you. It's doing those checks and balances. And so if it knows there's supposed to be a batch of this many files, and if it doesn't meet the configured minimum expectation, it could generate a report to you. But then there's those manual controls that we would expect to be happening, that somebody's going in and monitoring those reports that are coming out. Or if you know that the system is supposed to process, you know, 50 files in a certain time frame, is it doing that? So as much as we want to put in AI for everything, you know, you're always going to have the human aspect that has to go in and validate that the system is functioning as we expected. And because if something's getting lost in the system or stuck in like a holding queue, that's going to impact our customer base.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thank you for that. And, you know, it kind of made me think of one other category as we're talking about these IT controls. I told Stacey, I'm not by any means would ever consider myself an IT auditor, but I have tested some ITGCs, some application controls. So I don't want you all to be kind of daunted, like that you have to be be very, have a lot of extra education for that. But obviously, if you get into like looking at coding and those kind of things, it'd be great to have some of that IT knowledge, which we'll get to in just a second. One of the types of, I'm going to say, controls or processes that we started doing as an operational auditor outside of our IT audit team was looking at user access. And so I know this wasn't on my list of questions for you, Stacey, but it just got got to thinking, I'd love to know how you all handle user access, who has access to different systems, and who audits that in your world, because that's one of the most challenging audits I know I've done in my career, is trying to figure out who has access to what. Are the roles appropriate? Are we not just mirroring the roles, as someone leaves a position and starts a new one? So would you consider that an IT control in your world?
Absolutely. And that's where the system's going to control part of that if it's configured correctly. I shouldn't be able to look at somebody's social security number, but that's where that manual control comes in. But I would first say it all goes back up to that governance. What does the policy say? Who should have that access? So if, for example, at the city of Phoenix, our staff are required to look to see who has access to their systems every year. Because just because you gave them access today, did something change and they no longer need access? But also to that, if somebody hasn't accessed the system in 90 days, let's delete it. You're minimizing the risk by getting rid of people from the system that don't need access anymore. And some people will be like, but wait, I may need it. Okay, well, call us, or you may be unsure. Does this person really need access? And I know sometimes the IT smart people on the back end supporting it will just delete it. And they're like, well, they'll call us if they no longer have access to it.
Yeah.
So yeah, it is identifying who has the access. How often have they accessed the system? Did they change jobs? We struggle with that at the city, because today you may work in the police department, but then tomorrow you're going to be in the fire department. And when somebody leaves, you should be deleting their access to your proprietary systems. And that's where those manual controls are really going to come into place, running the reports and seeing who has access. But you could even go down to the level in the crux of the data and be like, what have they been accessing in your system? And is that appropriate? If somebody's logging into the system at 2:00 in the morning, is that normal? Or is that not? Because that could be a bad guy that stole somebody's credentials.
Yeah, I love that. And I love that you brought it back to IT governance, because I do think so much of our controls rely on these IT controls. They're almost foundational to our operational or manual controls that have to take place. Looking at making sure we have strong IT controls is honestly the number one step, I feel like. So critical to the organization. All right, so I want to just briefly end by talking about the CISA, CISA certification, which I know you have. So it's a certified information systems auditor, correct?
Yes, that is correct.
And that is issued through an organization called ISACA. And I just wanted Stacey to give you a little bit of background on that. And maybe if you remember what the exam looks like, I know you probably took it a while ago, but just tell them what that's about.
Yeah. So kind of going back into a little bit of my career, years ago, I was not loving where I was at in audit. And I was talking to a mentor, be like, what should I do? And she knew there was going to be an opening for an IT auditor. And I was like, I don't know anything about IT, just enough to break my computer every now and then. They're like, but look at it. And so I started doing some IT audits. And then through that, I realized, I could promote in my career if I got the CISA certification. So I went through the exam process, and it actually, though probably was one of the more stressful exam, because I knew it was contingent on this promotion, but the material provided by ISACA was very helpful to understand the different domains that I needed to be studying for. I will say that I would recommend any auditor should try to get this certification. And I say that because I would be hard pressed to say that there is not an audit that you're not going to do anymore that doesn't involve technology. And so if you're going in and you need to evaluate risk in the payroll department, some of the basic questions you want to ask are IT related. Who has access to the payroll data? If you're going to say the payroll's accurate, are you sure? So knowing just enough, and that's honestly, the CISA just gave me that enough of that base knowledge to go in and to understand maybe what questions I should ask that were IT related, so that I could do my payroll audit, or I could do an accounts receivable audit. So I think it's one of those things that has benefited me in my career. And I think it's something that every auditor, whether you get the certification or not, you need to be thinking about technology when you're doing your audits.
Yes, absolutely. So I've been kind of calling it almost every student needs to be data literate. So I think data is kind of one thing, and we'll talk about more about data analytics in another module and session, but just being data literate, and I think it's just IT literate. And I think you really brought together what some of the things we've been saying is it's foundational to every organization. It's foundational to every audit that you're going to do, like your payroll example. And I don't want it to be daunting, like you can't do it. We think of IT as such a specialty sometime, but I think with an audit, like you said, just having that basic information, go after it. And I think that's some great advice. And really my last question for you was any additional advice that you have for the students. I would love for you to share that with them. But I think this getting the CISA is a great advice too.
Yeah, I think the other thing that I would add, and it's completely off the subject to some extent of IT, is networking. You never know who's going to come into your life and put you on a career path. So I talked about this individual who was my mentor. I was venting to, I wasn't happy. And she said, start doing IT audits. And I can tell you, I would not be in the leadership seat I am today if I hadn't gone down that route. And I'm not saying you have to go down IT, but for me, networking with her and continuing to network with other individuals in the industry, whether it be technology or audit, it's just going to help your career along the way. And it's going to be where, when you get to a point where you need somebody's advice on how would you look at this audit, you're going to have a database of people that you can call. So really networking, and for some people, I know it's getting out of your comfort zone, but it really has benefited me in my career.
I love it. Such a great piece of advice for the students. Well, Stacey, thank you so much for joining us for a couple sessions. And yeah, I just really appreciate your time.
Yeah, thank you.